We are going to get started with the next presentation. We have grasshoppers, cutworms, and flea beetles. I feel like I want to say, oh my. Forecasting, monitoring, and management. With us today, we have John Gavloski, entomologist for Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development. John works in Carman, Manitoba, and conducts monitoring programs for Manitoba's major insect pests and provides information on insects and insect management to farmers, agronomists, and those working in the ag industry. John does numerous presentations and information updates for agronomists and farmers, and coordinates a weekly Manitoba crop pest update during the spring and summer. John has been with Manitoba Agriculture since 1997. He has a bachelor's degree in environmental biology and a master's of science degree in entomology from the University of Guelph. He completed his PhD in the Department of Entomology at University of Manitoba. And with that, we will welcome John as soon as we wire him up here.
Okay, well, thanks very much. And just a little bit about my presentation today. It's probably fitting that I follow a presentation on risk management because with insects, especially with forecasting, really what we are talking about is risk management. What do we expect for next year, and what can we do to maybe minimize our risk going into the following season? And I'm going to cover 3 insects today. I've got 7 listed here. The top 3 up here, those are what I consider to be our major, more serious insect pests from 2019. So flea beetles, they were certainly a big concern early on in the season. Whoops, wrong way there. So flea beetles were a major concern early on in the season. Unfortunately, we've got no silver bullets for dealing with flea beetles, so what I'll talk about is ways that you can minimize your risk with flea beetles. Grasshoppers, we've seen the populations resurging a little bit. I'll be showing you a forecast map for next year, what you can expect, and again, things that we might be able to do to minimize our risk somewhat. And cutworms. We seem to be building into a cutworm cycle. And once again, we'll go over what do we expect, and are there at least things to help you minimize your risks there as well. Now, the other 4 insects up there are what I consider to be moderate pests last year. So they were certainly problems, but they were more localized. And I'm not going to cover them in this presentation. If you've got questions later, you can ask me. And if not, I'll be speaking about them at other presentations. So we'll move ahead to flea beetles. So before I get into what to expect for next year, I'm going to start off with what happened in 2019 for each of the insects. So 2019, pretty much all of the canola seed that went into the ground had a neonicotinoid on it, whether it was Helix or Prosper, Lumoderm. Pretty much all the seed was treated. So you've got usually at least 3 weeks of protection from flea beetles with your seed treatment. Now, if you get a year where you have good growing conditions, you get quick germination, quick early growth, that might be enough, but that wasn't last year. Last year, in addition to the seed treatment, we had a lot of foliar spraying happening. There was actually a lot of reseeding that was happening. I know of people that had to spray their fields up to 5 times for flea beetles, which is very excessive. So definitely it was one of our I'll call it more serious or one of our worst flea beetle years. We've seen the populations climbing and plateauing at high levels for several years now. So they certainly were a big issue last year. Now, what can we expect for next year? And this is a really tricky one. Flea beetles do overwinter here. They're usually outside your fields. They're often in shrubby areas. Flea beetles like to crawl under a few inches of debris or vegetation to overwinter. And people have done studies where they've looked at no-till fields, conventional fields, versus your shelter belts, areas outside the field. they're moving outside your field. Even in the zero-till situations, they still seem to be moving outside the fields to overwinter. So that's where they are. Even when you have a few inches of snow, you've got good insulation there. And I usually suggest to people, don't count on overwintering mortality to any great extent. They likely will survive the winter okay. So what to expect for next year? The flea beetles that you saw last August and September, they're the exact same flea beetles that will be present next April, May, and June. So they overwinter as adults. So if you had a lot of flea beetles when you were harvesting your crop in the fall, the exact same beetles are going to be there the next season. So we can kind of use that as a guide. Way back in the 80s and early 90s, Ag Canada tried to do a study that correlated the fall populations with populations the next spring. The data was really messy. So there isn't a good correlation, but it's really the best we've got to go on. So I usually advise people, if you've got a lot in the fall, prepare for a lot the next spring. You may or may not get them, but prepare for them. And again, considering what's happened the last several years, we seem to be stuck at a chronically high level of flea beetles. I would be prepared for flea beetles going into the next season. So you'll already have some sort of seed treatment on your crop. What else can you do, though, to prepare? So I'll just cover a couple things. I know last year I had several growers tell me that they purposely seeded a bit later than they normally would to try to reduce their risk of flea beetles. So instead of seeding in maybe early May, they were holding off to mid-May to seed to try to reduce their risk. And that's actually not a bad practice. There's research to suggest that that can work. And I've got 3 studies listed up here. This study here was done in Manitoba by Lam et al. In the 80s, and they found that when they seeded at different times, it was the earlier seeded tests that suffered the more damage. And very similar research done in North Dakota here by Jan Knoedel. More recently, they got the same result. There's a 3rd study done in southern Alberta. They kind of got mixed results. But the bottom line is, with flea beetles, anything that you can do to get your crop from the seeding stage to the 3 to 4 leaf stage quickly is going to help minimize the damage. In some years, that delayed seeding might work. If we had had a good rain, say around May 20th, it probably would have worked for those growers. Problem is, it was very dry. It was cool, it was dry. The canola sat there. So even though they did seed a bit later, the strategy just didn't work last year because of the conditions. So this research is good in theory. Whether it actually works or not does depend a lot on the growing conditions. And really, no matter what you do to try to minimize risk, a lot does depend on growing conditions. Again, your canola has to get from the time you seed to that 3 to 4 leaf stage in 3 to 4 weeks for you to be at a lower risk of having to do those foliar sprays. So weather has to help you out with that one. A couple other things that you can do. Now, if you're not lucky enough to have some good soil moisture, seeding as shallow as available moisture will allow. That can help. Again, what you're trying to do is anything to get that plant from being a seed to a 3 to 4 leaf stage plant quickly. So seeding as shallow as the moisture will allow, that can help you with that. Increased seeding rate, that could work in a couple ways. You've got more plants in a given area. So if the flea beetles do destroy a few of them, you still might have an acceptable plant stand. And also it kind of dilutes out the feeding a little bit. So that can help. But I know with seeding rates, there's a lot of factors that go into that. Seed is getting more and more expensive, so cost of the seed factors in. So that's not always a practical one for everyone. So tillage. There has been research done, a lot of good research in both Manitoba and Alberta that has shown that reduced tillage can help reduce flea beetle damage. It won't eliminate it. It might reduce it somewhat. And the reason for that is that flea beetles prefer an environment where they've got bright sunlight, bright, sunny, dry conditions. That's what flea beetles really like. When you have a lot of trash and stubble, it creates more of a damp, humid environment, which is less favorable for the flea beetles. Now, that being said, you get a year like last year, even if you are doing, say, reduced or minimum tillage, you still may have had issues. We had some very high populations. But again, this is something that can help maybe reduce or minimize the risk somewhat, if it's practical for your situation. So we'll move on to cutworms, the second of our major pest species from last year. Now, the cutworm populations, we've seen them building for a few years. So last year wasn't a total surprise, but it was probably the worst cutworm year we've had in quite a while. Again, things have been building. We did have a few different species involved. I've got two of them posted here, Dingy Cut Worm and Redback Cut Worm. And even though they're both cutworms, they feed very differently. They behave very differently. So, Dingy Cut Worm, this one here. Dingy Cut Worm is what we classify as a climbing cutworm. So, they will come out of the soil, they'll munch on your plants at night, and then they go back in the soil during the day. They very rarely do a lot of clipping. So when people are doing crop scouting, if you're scouting during the day, you're going to see damaged plants. You won't see a lot of cut plants, but you're not going to see a lot of insects during the day. You have to dig around the plants. So this one can be confusing for a lot of crop scouts. Redback cutworm is a little bit different. Whoops, I'm going to go back here. Redback cutworm is... Here we go. Oh, my pointer's not working. Anyway, redback, the one on your right, it is a bit different. Redback cutworm will do a lot of clipping when they get bigger. So you get that telltale clipping that is happening. And the other big difference between these two, redback cutworm overwinters as an egg. So you probably won't start noticing the larger larva until later into May or into June. Dingy cutworm overwinters as a partially grown larva. So you'll see their feeding much earlier. Because they're already a partially grown larva, as soon as your crop starts coming up, if your crop starts coming up in early May, they're already partially grown larva feeding. Now, if you had both of these species in your field, a complex of these two species, you might notice a lot of feeding damage early on in May, and then you might notice a lot of feeding damage again later in the season when redback starts kicking in. And I know I had people last year commenting that the cutworm season seemed extremely long. And that's one possible reason. If you have a complex of these species, it kind of prolongs that feeding period. The other thing that I'm speculating might be happening with cutworms, we're getting a lot of years where we're not getting our first good hard frost until well into September or into October. Now, those hard frosts, even though they're not great for your cropping situation, they also kill off a lot of insects like cutworms and grasshoppers. If the cutworms are allowed to lay their eggs later and later into the season, you get a more staggered, spread out hatch the next season. That might be contributing to some of this staggered population that we're seeing. But I think probably the bigger factor last year was we had a complex of species involved. We had redbacked, we had dingy cutworm. I even had a few calls last year, people describing these really pale cutworms they were finding. And I had some people email me pictures, and they looked to me like pale western cutworm. And pale western cutworm, we don't usually see a lot of here. It's a dry weather cutworm. They usually deal with that more in southwestern Saskatchewan and eastern Alberta. We usually don't see a lot of it. But we've had 3 dry years in a row. So maybe it's not surprising that we're starting to see a little bit of pale western cutworm. And pale western cutworm presents a very different challenge because with pale western cutworm, they don't come above ground to feed like dingy and redbacked will. They do their feeding strictly below ground. So if you're applying insecticide to control them, you'll get decent control. You should get good control for dingy and redbacked. You won't get good control with pale western. They're a much harder cutworm to control. So we have to hope for possibly a wetter year that might help reduce some of the pests like pale western cutworm. Otherwise, if we start to see their population continue to increase, that presents some bigger issues. So forecasting cutworms for 2020. Just like with flea beetles, this is a really tricky one to do. People have tried to do research to help us out with this. The study up on the screen here by Aaron Lamb, what they did was they put out light traps for almost a decade in farmers' fields. and they counted all the different types of cutworms they got in their traps, and they tried to correlate that to spring populations. Again, the data wasn't good. There's not an easy way to predict cutworms using light traps or pheromone traps. Both have been tried. It doesn't work that well. The best advice we have is timely scouting in the spring. We had a lot of cutworms last year. They overwinter here, so I would say expect high cutworm levels next year. But again, that's just my hunch. I don't have good data to really back that up. But given the way our cycles work, with cutworms, normally you get 3 or 4 bad years. It's almost like a bell curve where the populations build, you get 3 or 4 bad years, and then the populations tail off. That's usually the way cutworm cycles go. Now, we've had easily at least 3 years where we could see the population building. I'm hoping last year was the peak. That certainly was a pretty high or bad year. So I'm hoping things start to tail off. But even if they do, you're still just going over the other side of that peak. So I usually, unless we get something that really kills out a lot of them, like a pathogen like a virus or a fungal pathogen, I would say scout your fields starting as soon as the crops are coming up, and just be vigilant for cutworms going into 2020. Now, one of the questions I got a few times last year, people were scouting for their cutworms. They controlled them in some cases, and then they were out there the day after they sprayed, poking around and noticing the odd live cutworm. And they were wondering, what's going on here? Did my spray not work? Now, I did mention that we did have a few cases of pale western cutworm where the sprays didn't work. But there were also other cases where, yeah, I think the sprays were working. People just weren't giving it enough time. And with cutworms, what happens is they have feeding periods, and then they have periods where they're not feeding. They're going through something called a molt. For a cutworm to grow, it stops feeding. They shed their skin, and then they have to kind of they grow a little bit and then reform the cuticle over their body. For that whole period, they're not feeding. So you've got a couple days where they're in the soil, inactive, not feeding. That's called going through a molt. They're not going to be killed by insecticides. So if you spray for cutworms, give it a couple days. All the products that are out there that are registered have enough residual that eventually they will kill the cutworms. But if a cutworm's going through a molt, the next day it may still be alive in the soil. It wasn't feeding that evening. So I always encourage people, give it a couple days before you decide that your insecticide maybe wasn't working for cutworms. The other thing that I just wanted to address is regarding cutworm feeding. If we have a crop like canola and you've, say, lost 10% of your seedlings, does that mean you're going to have a 10% yield loss? And the answer to that question is no. Some crops can compensate somewhat for cutworm feeding. Canola can actually compensate fairly well. And the study that I've got up here from McGregor, this was done in Manitoba, and what they were doing was they were actually physically clipping plants and measuring how neighboring plants responded and taking leaves off of individual plants and how does that plant respond. And what they did find is you can actually remove quite a few plants, and the neighboring plants will produce more pods, more seeds, and heavier seeds. So it does fill in, and things do compensate somewhat. So 10% of your seedlings gone does not mean 10% yield loss. Now, the Canola Council does have guidelines for acceptable plant stands. And I would say follow those, use those. If you get to the point where you suspect you're going to drop below an acceptable plant stand, then you probably do need to control things. If you've got a lot of plants and you do start to see some disappearing, again, factor in that if it's just a few plants here and there that seem to be going missing, neighboring plants will fill in and canola can somewhat compensate. The same with flax. This study here was done in Manitoba by AIR, and same thing. You remove a few plants, some of the neighboring plants do fill in and somewhat compensate for the feeding. So we'll move into the third insect here, grasshoppers. And I'll spend a little bit more time on this one just because, for one reason, it's an easier one for us to forecast. And number two, I had a lot of questions on grasshoppers last year. So some of them regarding what the weather will or will not do to grasshoppers, natural enemies, and what people can be doing. So I'm going to try to address all three of those things. So first, what happened last year? So the last couple years, we've seen grasshopper populations building. Going from 2017 to 2018, we saw a bit of a jump. Going from 2018 to 2019, we saw a bigger jump. So populations have been building. 2018, there was a little bit of spraying, a lot of edge spraying, not a lot. 2019, there was a bit more, both edge spraying and whole fields. Part of what was happening, too, people who had pasture land, who were cutting their hay, things were really dry, and the pasture was not growing well. To compound things, they had grasshoppers in there, and with the dry conditions, the pastures just couldn't compensate well, and they were getting quite a bit of yield loss because of that. So I know people that were spraying pastures last year, some of their field crops. Grasshopper populations were just a bit more magnified last year than the previous year. So their population certainly has been going up. So that's what happened last year. Now, what to expect for 2020? We have been doing grasshopper surveys in Manitoba actually since the early 30s. So back in the 30s, dirty 30s, that's when you had the migratory grasshoppers that were a big serious problem, and people started doing grasshopper surveys at that time, and it's continued on to some form or another since then. So they've been done a long time. What we do now for grasshopper surveys is we go out in August, we have people that are basically walking your field edges and your ditches and trying to approximate the number of grasshoppers per meter square. We take all this data and we try to do a forecast map. Now, before I get to the forecast map, I should point out, not every grasshopper is a bad grasshopper, and they're not all the same. So I've got a few different things on the screen here. I've got on your right, a couple solid green grasshoppers. These have long antenna. These are katydids. They'll never move into and feed on a field crop or a crop in general. They're considered non-pest grasshoppers. In fact, in Western Canada, we've got roughly 180 species of grasshoppers. Before I go on to my forecast, how many pest species of grasshoppers do we have out of the 180? Somebody want to throw out a number? I heard 3 and I heard 4, and I think I'll say that both are correct. Okay? The answer I have written down is 4. But one of those 4, Packard grasshopper, we really don't see a lot of in Manitoba. It's more of a dryland species. So here, really, two-striped migratory and clearwing grasshopper, those 3 species. If we have a bad grasshopper problem, it's going to be one of those or maybe a complex of those 3 species. So 3 to 4 bad species, that's what we're trying to monitor, and that's what we're trying to map with our grasshopper forecasts. So here's our forecast map for 2020, and the way the map works, anything in a shade of green here is where our counts were a little bit lighter. Anything in yellow is getting more into a moderate risk. Anything in orange, we're starting to climb into what we call a more severe risk. Now, severe not to scare you, but really to maybe send the message, you definitely want to be out scouting for grasshoppers, and you probably want to start that scouting. Early June's a good time. All of our pest grasshoppers overwinter as eggs in the soil. Those eggs usually start hatching in early June, and if you do have a heavier population and you're on top of it early, it's much easier to deal with grasshoppers in June and early July than it is in August. So it's good to get to know where the heavier populations are earlier in the season. So this is sort of the breakdown of our data from our forecast. Of our, higher counts, greater proportion were in the southwest than in any other region of the province. The eastern part of the province counts were a fair amount, quite a bit lighter than they were, say, in the southwest. So western part of Manitoba, you're probably at a bit of a higher risk than, say, somebody in the Beausejour, eastern part of the province, that region. And actually, to me, Static maps are good, but I think grasshopper data is often useful to compare it over a number of seasons and see what populations are doing. And so here's grasshopper forecast maps from the past 5 years. And you can see what the data is doing here. Our forecast for 2016, 17, and 18, mainly all green on the maps. Last year's forecast, we started to get a bit more yellow and a little bit of orange. And then this year's forecast, a lot more yellow and a lot more orange. So you can kind of see the trend that's happening here. We've had 3 hot, dry years in a row, and we've got the populations really starting to build. So if we get another hot, dry year, I would expect that population might continue to build. If we get some wet conditions, we might see the opposite start to happen. So a lot is probably going to depend on the weather, but that's been the trend that's been happening with grasshopper populations. So one of the questions I've been getting regarding grasshoppers recently is we had a very wet September, and we had actually quite a bit of snow around Thanksgiving. And people were wondering, so does that mean our risk of grasshoppers is reduced for next year? The short answer is don't count on it. And the reason I say that is because, again, our pest grasshoppers all over winter in the egg stage. Just to give you an example of how resilient the eggs are to moisture, a colleague of mine in Lethbridge who studies grasshoppers, he took grasshopper egg pods, put them in a glass of water, and let them sit for a week. He then dumped the water out, put the eggs back on the soil. They hatched. Grasshopper eggs are very resilient to excess moisture. So heavy rains in late September, October, heavy rains in April, May are not going to kill the grasshoppers. The same heavy rains in June could kill the grasshoppers. When grasshoppers are really vulnerable is the young juvenile stage. So once those eggs hatch and we get into the juvenile stages, they become more vulnerable. So a good heavy rain in early June could really take a grasshopper population down. The same rain in early May probably won't do much. So it's all timing. Not that you want heavy rains in early June, but the reality is that's what takes them down. We had a population building in the early 2000s. It was starting to build up. I think it was 2004. We had a really wet June. Stevensfield Park, near where I live, was just flooded. We couldn't even get in there to do our scout camp. It was really, really excess moisture that year in early June. The population just crashed after that. The next several years, our forecast maps were all low. So timely rains can really help reduce the population. So I've kind of answered that question. The fall conditions we did have probably did allow enough eggs to get laid that you should still be concerned going into next year. September was not great for egg laying. It was very wet and rainy, damp. August was pretty good, though. August was hot. The grasshoppers had good egg laying conditions, so we probably still do have a decent number of eggs going into next year. So September was a bit wetter. Probably slowed down their egg laying somewhat. But again, still be vigilant. As far as winter kill goes, as long as we have a little bit of snow on the ground, the grasshopper eggs are probably safe. It takes about minus 15 degrees, a couple inches down into the soil to kill grasshopper eggs significantly. So again, if we get good snow cover, that's enough insulation that we normally don't get a lot of winter kill with the grasshopper eggs. Can happen, but don't anticipate it. And again, the spring conditions, rain can help, but it's timely. Those early heavy rains probably won't do much. Later rains could help reduce the grasshopper populations. So we'll move into predators. The other thing that can take grasshopper populations down is natural enemies. And I've got a few of them pictured here, and I'll show you the ones that we saw a lot of last year. Bee flies. You often don't see a lot of these. Bee flies, there's a lot of different species. There's over 100 species of bee flies in Western Canada. Bee flies kind of look like bumblebees. But you'll notice that they're not a bumblebee. They're two wings, more fly-like. But they call them bee flies. As adults, they like to feed on nectar and pollen, but they lay their eggs near grasshopper egg pods, and they actually have ways of tracking grasshoppers and knowing where the grasshoppers laid their eggs. And then they lay their eggs near the grasshopper egg pods. When the larvae hatch, they go right for the grasshopper egg pods and consume them. So we saw a lot more bee flies last year than I'm used to seeing. That's a good sign. The other thing we saw a lot of last year was this black species of blister beetle. So this is called the black blister beetle. And they've got quite an interesting life cycle. Once again, grasshopper eggs are the favorite food of the larvae. And just like the bee flies, they'll lay their eggs near grasshopper egg pods. When the eggs hatch from the blister beetles, they've got a very active larva that is good at crawling through the soil and finding the grasshopper egg pods. Once they find the egg pods, they start feeding. And the next stages of the blister beetle larva, they start losing their legs. They've got no reason to move around anymore. They found their lifetime food supply in that big pod of grasshopper eggs. So they lose their legs and they just sit there chowing down on grasshopper eggs the rest of their larval life. And then they come out as these black blister beetles later in the summer. And you'll see these on your canola, on your alfalfa. They'll feed right on the flowers. Usually not a major concern. But again, good side to these things. They do feed on grasshopper eggs. And a third one I've got pictured here is field crickets. Field crickets will actually dig up grasshopper eggs and feed on the grasshopper egg pods. So if you see a lot of field crickets in the fall, they do have a good side to them. They're grasshopper egg pod predators as well. And I've mentioned ground beetles as well. Those are the larger, usually black or brown beetles that if you turn over a board or kick over a clump of soil, you see these large beetles scurrying around. Those are usually ground beetles, and some species are good at going into the soil and digging for grasshopper egg pods as well. Now, what I didn't see a lot of last year because of the dry conditions was this here. Grasshoppers that are dying at the top of the plants. And when you start seeing this happen, it's because a fungus has infected the grasshopper. So what happens here is the grasshoppers get infected and their behavior changes. Their brain's been messed with. They end up climbing to the top of the plant and dying, clinging to the top of the plant. And what's happening inside them as they're at the top of the plant is the fungal spores are reproducing in their body. The pressure gets enlarged, and eventually the cuticle splits open and the fungal spores can spread because they're at the top of the plant. Some years we will see a lot of this. Last year we didn't see too much. Again, because it was hot and dry. The fungal pathogens do better in wet years. So this is one other reason why grasshopper populations do well in the hot, dry years. They have less of these pathogens. So something like this would help take those populations down. But again, we weren't seeing a lot of that last year. One of the questions I had at a couple of my meetings earlier this year, people were wondering, if we're burning our ditches, is that going to help reduce grasshoppers for next year? And the answer to that is no. This research here was done in North Dakota, and so what they were doing was they were burning ditches and they were measuring grasshopper mortality. What they did find, some of the non-pest species of grasshoppers, where the eggs are right at the soil surface pretty much, they were getting killed by the burning. Our pest species were all deep enough in the soil that really no mortality. So you've got reasons why or why not you might be burning your ditches, but if you're doing it to try to kill grasshopper eggs, it's probably not doing what you think it should be doing. So the best advice I can give you right now is start scouting for grasshoppers. Look for the egg pods. These are grasshopper egg pods. They kind of look like brown rice, clumps of brown rice. Grasshoppers lay their eggs in what we call pods. So usually you've got about 20 or 40 eggs clustered together. Each individual egg looks like a grain of brown rice, and they're kind of all smacked together. So these are grasshopper egg pods. If you're digging around in the soil early, you start seeing a lot of those. You know you've got some good grasshopper egg populations in the area. But what you really want to be looking for is the young nymphs that are hatching out in early June. So start scouting in early June, and look for those young nymphs that might be in the fields. Oops. Our clicker is freezing up on us. Oh, here we go. Okay, so the other thing that people were asking about, just going to make sure I'm on the right slide here. Things are moving slowly with the advancer. Oh, maybe I'm not pointing high enough. Here we go. Okay, thanks. Okay, so the other thing people were asking about over the past summer is when we get into adult grasshoppers, they can be a frustration for people because they're moving around a lot. They're hard to manage. Some of the products that are out there are costly. People were looking for maybe cheaper ways they can control adult grasshoppers, particularly on crops like pasture land, where you don't have a very high-value commodity the way you do with some other things. So how do we manage grasshoppers in those situations? So I'm going to show you a study here that was done in Wyoming. And what they did in this study was they were treating a 100-foot swath for grasshoppers. The next 100 feet, they didn't spray. They sprayed the next 100, didn't spray the next. So they were spraying in swaths. And by doing so, of course, you've reduced your insecticide costs by roughly 1/2. But you'll get a lot more than 50% grasshopper control. They did this with several different insecticides. And when they used carbaryl is 7. And they were using the 50-50 split there. And what they found was when they did the whole rangeland or pasture with 7, they got 94% kill. When they did it in strips and they treated half of the pasture, they got 81% kill. That's because grasshoppers don't stay put. Once they get beyond their initial stages, they're moving around very actively. So they're moving from the unsprayed to the sprayed swaths, and they're getting killed. So you can see 81% kill, that's still pretty acceptable. When they did it with malathion, I'll get back to that slide. Here we go. When they did it with malathion, they did 80% of the pasture with malathion. They got 91% control versus 90. Don't read into that too much. It's essentially the same. There was no difference. The bottom one, fipronil. Fipronil is a very high residual product. Something similar. I'll use the analogy of our coragen. We don't have fipronil here. It's not registered. Fipronil is a very high residual product. They were spraying 1/3 of their pasture with strips of fipronil, and they got 92% control versus 98% when they did the whole pasture. So, again, if you're in a situation where you're doing a crop such as a pasture land for adult grasshoppers, this is something you might need or want to consider. Way that you can save money, use less insecticide, and it also leaves some refuge for the natural enemies as well. Now, one caveat to this research, so far this has only been tested on rangelands in Wyoming. I'm trying to encourage people, I'd like to see this tested here in Manitoba on cereal crops. I do know people who are trying this on cereal crops last year. It's never been really researched formally in those crops, but it's a very interesting concept and technique, but something that we still need a bit more research on. And as I mentioned, if you're interested in more on this, University of Wyoming has some stuff on their website, and you can look up some more information there. If you're interested in information on any of our forecasts, I've got everything posted on our Manitoba Agriculture website. So go to our crops and insect pages. We've got our Grasshopper Forecast up there. We've got fact sheets on flea beetles, cutworms. We also post data on Bertha armyworms, diamondback moth, things like that. So if you're interested in any more information, again, go to our website. We've got all our forecasts posted. So just to summarize things, what you should be considering going into next year, flea beetles and cutworms. They both overwinter here. They were both abundant last year. So early season, starting as soon as your crops are up, be scouting for both flea beetles and for cutworms. Regardless of what you have on your seed, be scouting. because as mentioned, the seed treatments only last for so long. We do have some newer seed treatments for cutworms in our cereal crops, in our pulse crops. So that is an option for you if you got burned last year and you're wanting to put something down with the seed. We now do have seed treatments for cutworms in cereals, peas. There's also things in corn and canola as well. So you do have those as options. And grasshoppers. Again, based on what we saw with our forecast, levels are climbing. So going into next year, be thinking grasshoppers. Unless we get a really wet summer, you want to be starting that scouting in June. Concentrate on those field edges, areas where they might be overwintering, and try to be on top of that one early as well. And the one thing that we can't predict well is the weather that far in advance. Weather and natural enemies are going to be the two things that really determine to what extent those populations continue to build or decline. And as mentioned, really what we need for at least a couple of these is some moisture. If we get another hot, dry year, again, we could see at least some heavier populations of things like grasshoppers and cutworms. So maybe I'll end with that, and I'll entertain any questions on either these insects or any other insects that you might have questions on. So we got about 5 minutes for questions. Yeah. So any questions?
You mentioned burning for grasshoppers, but burning for flea beetles help at all?
So the question is, does burning help for flea beetles? Short answer is no. Now, to be fair, no one's really ever done this research, so this is my speculation. But flea beetles are overwintering as adults. They're going outside your field. Usually it's not the ditches that they're overwintering in big numbers. It's usually more shelter about shrubby areas that you likely wouldn't be burning. That's where you get your bigger populations of flea beetles overwintering, and they're getting down underneath debris into the soil a little bit. So odds are burning isn't going to do a lot to control flea beetles. Okay, other questions?
I was disappointed to hear that the rain in September wasn't going to solve our grasshopper problems. It came down pretty hard here. Are you really sure, John?
Well, as mentioned, my colleague Dan Johnson, he took his grasshopper egg pods, he put them in a glass of water for a week.
I know.
Dumped the water out, the eggs hatched. Eggs are really resilient. There's a coating on the grasshopper eggs. It's called a chorion. It's a coating, and it's very resilient. It doesn't let the water get in at the more vulnerable parts of that egg. So, don't count on it.
Don't count on it. Yeah. So get out and monitor in spring or in early summer for sure.
That's right. Yes.
There's a question here.
I heard talk about some correlation with loose soil or not loose soil with cutworms situation, and we thought we maybe saw a situation in the wheel track of our seeding tractor where the population withstood the cutworm damage or there was less cutworm damage in the actual wheel track. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the questions regarding soil and loose soil versus more packed soil, and will the cutworm damage be more or less? And the tricky part is there's different species of cutworms, and some of them like a looser soil, and some of them it really doesn't matter as much. And so I don't have good evidence to say that a packed soil is going to be any more resilient, because it probably does depend somewhat on the species of cutworm that you're dealing with. So it may in some cases, but I wouldn't want to generalize and state that it Yeah, but I certainly won't go on record as recommending rolling as a cutworm control method. It's been untested, and again, my gut feeling is it probably does depend on the species you're dealing with somewhat. So.
Time for one more question, if there is. Not seeing any questions. If you wouldn't mind joining in thanking me for John's presentation today.